Oh. Right, you should be able to see my screen now. Very good. Okay. So, right, the EU's Green Deal and in particular its impact on the eastern neighborhood of which Belarus is a part. The presentation consists of 4 sections. Why is there a Green Deal? What is the Green Deal and what we expect to happen next? So why is there a Green Deal? Well, the Green Deal's objectives are to continue to allow us to live at current or indeed improving standards of living. But while we respect what is referred to as the boundaries of the planetary system. So with reduced levels of pollution, reduced levels of greenhouse gas emissions, and overall a low impact on the environment. So no more deforestation and reduction in the loss of biodiversity. And the Green Deal specifically then sets out how this will be achieved, what investments are needed, the financing tools that are available, and also a timeline to deliver these objectives. So I will briefly recap why it actually came about. Since 1996, the world has an agreement, which was originally referred to as the Kyoto Protocol, to address the climate change phenomenon, which is also now often called the climate crisis. And in fact, climate change has turned into climate crisis because not much has been done about it since 1996. So climate change is the change in the climate due to greenhouse gas emissions that are caused by humans, so by burning fossil fuels, by releasing, for example, HFC gases into the atmosphere, and by deforestation. And it affects both the overall climate system, but also at a more micro level, the weather and seasonality as well. So some of you may have noted that, for example, blooming season and agricultural growth seasons are shifting and are moving earlier. It's a long-term trend that is caused by the accumulation of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that really started to change with the industrial and pre-industrial period. So since about 1850, when the burning of fossil fuels in order to support economic growth and human life became more commonplace. So we have now realized that we are facing a fairly massive problem. And as a professor from UCL put it yesterday, we are playing around with forces that we cannot control. Yeah, so there isn't an easy solution to this particular problem. So here are some key statistics. And we currently expect that the global average temperature will reach 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial levels sometime between 2030 and 2052. That doesn't sound like a lot, but this is global average. So local temperatures will shift quite, or could shift quite dramatically. And this is a phenomenon that we're already seeing in the Arctic. And already there are quite a few regions that have experienced this. And right now there's an estimate that up to 40% of people are living in regions that are already experiencing this level of warming. So the key concerns historically have been sea level rise, which will affect coastal regions. Now, I appreciate that's not much of a problem in Belarus, but it certainly is a problem in places like Bangladesh. And also increased ocean acidity. Again, not a problem in Belarus, but that will affect marine life. So you could see coral reef collapse, for example, which will then have impacts on fish populations. We are also seeing changing rain and snowfall patterns. And this is actually something that has led to the phenomenon of climate change being discounted a little bit. It was often referred to as global warming. And every time that someone had a severe winter, they said, well, there's definitely no global warming here. But as I noted, the actual impacts fall regionally quite differently. So the fact that it's a particularly cold winter in the northeastern United States doesn't mean that there isn't an overall warming of the globe. I think people in India would have quite a different view on that. These changes to rain and snowfall patterns then affect the potential for disasters. And you see severe droughts, you see substantial increases in wildfires. Now, and that I think is a concern in Belarus. There are crop losses and water shortages. We also see that in regions exposed to very severe weather phenomena, so such as the Caribbean, we see increases of hurricanes. In the Pacific, we see increasing typhoons. These storms are not just becoming more, they're also becoming stronger. And overall, there are more floods and droughts, depending on where you are. So the number of these weather-related natural disasters has about tripled since 1960. And while each individual one cannot be tied back to global warming or the climate change, it should be clear that by the time you look at it, you take a step back and you look at it as the whole population of disasters, then you're really looking at a fundamental change in the experience that we have with ongoing weather and climate. The other problem is that this is actually quite expensive. So in 2019, the cost of dealing with these weather-related disasters was about 100 billion US dollars. And 15 of these disasters were above $1 billion in scale, each one. So it obviously depends on where they hit. But when a hurricane hits Texas or the northeastern United States, so very wealthy regions, it tends to smash up a lot of infrastructure, it tends to destroy a lot of housing, and that is very expensive in these regions. We don't necessarily hear about as much about natural disasters in other parts of the world because the cost is much lower since people are much less wealthy and there's less to destroy. So about 20 years after the Kyoto Protocol, governments had finally realized that doing nothing was no longer an option. And the Paris Agreement was arrived at in 2015. And this is now governing pretty much everyone's response to climate change. It has impacts at the policy level, national planning, development planning, and reaches down into sectoral level, and overall, I think will quite fundamentally reshape the way that countries think about their long-term development. So the Paris Agreement had a sort of bifurcated objective. It wanted to, it aimed to restrict global warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, but aimed to really restrict it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, as I noted before, we're probably going to reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius within the next 20 years. And that is pretty much unavoidable at this point. So I personally, I do not think that we will be able to do enough and fast enough to stay below 1.5. Now, the difference between 1.5 and 2 doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually has a very substantial impact. There are probably hundreds of millions of people who are more exposed to climate change under a 2-degree scenario than there are under a 1.5 degree scenario. The impact of drought, impact on food, food security will be much, much more severe in the 2-degree scenario. Sea level rise will be more severe as well. So in order to address the, or to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement, every country that wanted to participate was asked to prepare what was then called an intended nationally determined contribution, And when the Paris Agreement was arrived at, these were converted to nationally determined contributions. So this means that a country under its own control, so it's not being told by somebody else to do something, but under its own control develops a plan to handle climate change and identify the sectors where actions can be taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or where adaptation actions are required. And alongside the nationally determined contributions, which are this sort of short-term documents, so they normally cover the next 5 to 10 years, and they can be relatively detailed, so already identify concrete projects that could be invested in. Alongside these short-term documents, countries were also asked to prepare low-emission development strategies reaching out to 2050. And these documents really would lay out a development path for each country, again, under its own control, that would identify how it would grow and how it would become wealthier and become more developed, but do so in a way that is aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. At this point, 197 countries have signed the Paris Agreement, so it's pretty much everybody, and 190 have ratified it. So that's quite extraordinary and certainly a very big step up from what happened with the Kyoto Protocol. And we now see this filter down into actions at government level. So here's the challenge. This is a chart from this week, actually, last week. The International Energy Agency last week published a report on how we can get to what is called net zero emissions by 2050, i.e. we stop adding more greenhouse gas to the atmosphere. And someone from the International Renewable Energy Agency, I think, very kindly put together this little graph. So the black line is where we are right now. That's the annual emissions that are being added to the atmosphere. And you can see the big dip between 2019 and 2020, that's COVID. And I expect the 2021 number probably to increase somewhat. The 2022 number will definitely get back to where 2019 was, in my view. So under the policies as they are in place now, that's a blue line, you can see we're nowhere near where we need to be. Yeah, in fact, not much will change in terms of total emissions. What will change under these policies is that for each extra unit of GDP, you will have less emissions because countries will grow richer in that time. So countries have, however, announced a lot of pledges to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that have not yet been converted into policies. That's the yellow line. And if you follow that, then the story looks a little bit better. But the problem is, if we even want to get somewhere close to 2 degrees, then we really need to stop all emissions by 2050. And that's a green line. So you can see that there's a very substantial gap. And from the European Union's perspective, the Green Deal is supposed to close the gap between the yellow and the green line, at least as far as the EU is concerned. So the question is always, it's very nice to have objectives. So we know where we are right now. We know where we want to get to in 2050. What we don't quite know is how we get there. Yeah, so a miracle would be nice, but that's probably unlikely to happen. And therefore, the miracle from the EU is the EU Green Deal. So there's 3 core objectives in the deal. There will be no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. The EU will be climate neutral. Economic growth will therefore be decoupled from resource use. That means that for every additional unit of GDP, less energy will be used, less waste will be generated, and eventually a lot of this will turn either to zero or indeed even become negative. And quite importantly, that no person and no place is left behind. This is a critical element because depending on where you are in the EU, you are more or less exposed to dealing with climate change. The key challenge here is for Belarus, no person and no place does not refer to Belarus. It's an internal EU objective. So what's happening outside the EU cares about it, but it's not responsible for it. And they will use their development aid and sort of international cooperation policies to help countries, but it's not something that they are that they are really responsible for, and therefore this doesn't actually help Belarus very much at the moment. So in order to reach the objectives of the EU Green Deal, all sectors of the EU economy will have to contribute. So they will have to boost the efficiency when it comes to resource use. There will need to be a move towards a clean circular economy. And there will also be a move to restoring nature and cutting other forms of pollution as well in order to restore biodiversity, reforestation, and really, quite frankly, turn back the clock a little bit on industrialization and give nature a boost. So the vision is, as noted, we will all continue to live well. So roughly at probably at the current level of quality of life. But we will do so, unlike now, while we respect the boundaries of the system. So, because essentially what we're doing right now with our lifestyle, and this is true for for every developed and every transition economy, we are essentially taking resources from future generations. So our current lifestyle is based on using up resources that our children and grandchildren need to have a lifestyle that's even comparable to ours. So it's basically the same as if you, as an individual, take out big loans in order to live really nicely during your lifetime, and then you leave all the debt to your heirs on your desk. That's what we're doing as a global population. It's an unsustainable lifestyle. It will have to come to a stop. And the only question is, how will the stop happen? So is it sort of a gentle slowing down and changing things, or is it going to be a car crash? And that's, at the moment, something we still have control over, but if we wait another 10 years, it's going to be a car crash. We will have lost that level of control. So the Green Deal sets out how will we ensure a just and inclusive transition. So that is, nobody should be left behind. So the question is, what's going to happen to the coal miners in Poland? What's going to happen to the gas workers in the Netherlands? And what's going to happen to the workers who are currently manufacturing cars in Germany that will no longer be sellable because they run on petrol? It sets out the investments, financing tools, and the timeline, as I noted. So the operational plan of the Green Deal will be achieved by investing in environmentally friendly technologies, support to industry to innovate and become cleaner, rolling out cleaner, cheaper, healthier forms of private and public transport. And there's a big EU investment program for that. Then decarbonizing the energy sector. That's probably the most successful part of the operation right now. That's going quite well. Substantial investments in buildings to make them more energy efficient. That's, I think, quite a challenge in Belarus as well. And international cooperation to work at a global level. This is just bringing it all together on one slide. And you can see how the whole thing is being conceived as a circle, because it is essentially based on the concept of a circular economy, where we reuse resources and we don't just take something away from the future. And the EU itself sees itself as a global leader in this transition, and that's, I think, quite correct. They are driving a lot of the policies that are being implemented simply by virtue of implementing them themselves. And there's about half a billion people living in the EU, so it has an impact. So on implementation, well, the Green Deal is essentially implemented now. In a way, some of it is just a statement of things that are going on right now, such as decarbonization of the energy sector. It's subsidiary, so member states will undertake actions or decide what actions to undertake in line with their commitments under the Green Deal and their obligations. In terms of operations outside the EU, it's DG NEAR and DG DEFCO who will lead on the implementation. So they are the ones who are providing support, for example, to accession countries. They are the ones who are going to provide support to the Eastern Partnership to also move on to this path. And then in terms of finance, both the EIB and the EBRD, who are either fully or partially owned by the EU, have strong climate mandates already. So they have minimum investment requirements at portfolio level. In the EIB, they're called climate windows. So I'm not quite sure what the latest figure is there, but I think it's somewhere between 20 and 30% probably. And I expect that to increase quite rapidly of investment that has to be climate relevant. For the EBRD, the target will move up to 60% of its portfolio. It's important to note that these are portfolio targets, so it's not every individual operation. So, but in the EBRD at least, so it's a bank I know very well because I used to work there. You know, every country office will be given this target as well. So the country office in Belarus will have a target of achieving a certain amount of GET, the green economy transition eligible investments. And so that's what they're going to look for to finance. Right, so now briefly on the Eastern Partnership. Oops, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. There we go. Right, so in the Eastern Partnership, the intention is to transform the region to achieve a fairer and more prosperous society in the countries of the Eastern Partnership. Modernization, increased resource efficiency, introduction of circular economy approaches, and overall cleaning up the environment. This will be done by increasing environmental and climate action in the countries of the Eastern Partnership. So there will be a lot of focus on supporting policy development, supporting investments that, that focus on that, and the more sustainable use of natural resources. And the whole thing will be looked at quite holistically. So there is a push to scale up investments and actions in areas that also affect people's health and well-being. So, for example, reduction of air pollution, increased water quality, those kind of actions. And at the same time, there will be continued investment in the environmental governance and awareness raising in order to make sure that the countries and the citizens of these countries can buy into this transition. So accelerating the shift to sustainable smart mobility, developing new green jobs, and developing local renewable energy resources, and halting the loss of biodiversity. So there will be, in the Eastern Partnership, direct and indirect impacts from the Green Deal. For the direct impacts, well, I've already noted that there will be almost certainly increased EU support and EIB, EBRD financing for investments on climate action, energy efficiency, renewables, and clean transport. It is likely that the enhanced performance standards that will come for products that are being used in the EU will require redesign of these products over time. So if you, for example, have a washing machine manufacturing site in Belarus that exports to the EU, you will have to adjust the kind of products that are being made there to comply with increasing energy efficiency requirements. And then what we're going to talk about later, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is almost certain to be introduced to prevent companies in the Eastern Partnership from competing with companies inside the EU on the basis of not having to pay for their carbon emissions. Indirect impacts, well, There will be fuel switching of vehicles and home heating, and that will reduce demand for some products that could also affect Belarus. So, for example, oil products are one of these things. For Ukraine, a critical issue will be what will happen to gas transit when the EU slowly moves out of gas. And I expect that at a personal level, increasing environmental concerns will change consumption habits. So people will want to buy things that are being made closer to home and where they can rely on the environmental quality and standards of these products. Right, and I will talk about the carbon adjustment mechanism in the second part of my presentation. So that closes the first one. Thank you very much, Irina, and sorry again for the hiccup at the start.
Все хорошо, Андреа, спасибо большое за презентацию, за повествование зеленой сделки, ее цели, необходимое финансирование и воздействие на восточное партнерство. Сейчас у нас по программе мы передадим слово профессору Луке Ташине, профессору из бизнес-школы Эдинбургского университета и научно-исследовательского института при Лондонской школе экономики. Профессор Ташини расскажет нам об углеродном ценообразовании, мерах рыночного регулирования и государственного управления. Лука, пожалуйста, вам слово.
Thank you very much. I'll start sharing my slides. That should be okay. Okay, so let me know if something is not popping up correctly. Pleasure for me to be here. Thank you very much. Very glad to contribute to this EU for Climate workshop. I will be talking about carbon pricing. In particular, I will briefly discuss the how and why pricing carbon. I will review the theory that underpins carbon pricing, and hopefully we will understand what are really the driving motivation for pricing carbon. Then I will describe key global, regional, and national carbon pricing policies. And then I will almost immediately dive into the carbon leakage, meaning the potential risks of negative competitiveness. I'll try to say a few words about what is it, what is really the root of the problem in this particular case, what are the available solutions, meaning the policies and the design mechanisms that can be used to mitigate competitiveness issues. And then I'll be discussing the three key policies. The current one that is at the moment implemented, free allowance allocation. I'll talk about a second possible policy, linking and expanding basically the ETS and linking potentially with the neighboring ones. And finally, just a few words about the carbon border adjustment measure as a policy that could be used to mitigate negative competitiveness, but Andreas will be talk more about this. And then I'll conclude by saying a few things about what does European carbon border adjustment measure mean for the UK. As you all probably know, UK now being outside the continental Europe will be facing potentially the same risk of us EU CBM. Okay, so why pricing carbon? The key concept here is externality. Textbook definition is that an externality is a cost or benefit caused by a producer that is not financially incurred or received by that producer. So for the case of a negative externality, these usually stem from the production of a good or service. When there are externalities, markets tend to overproduce. That is the case of negative externalities, or they do tend to underproduce. And this is potentially the case for positive externalities. So when we have externalities, markets fail. And that means that basically free markets are unable to allocate resources efficiently. So free markets do not function properly because they do not allocate resources in the most efficient way. And this is an immediate justification. This justifies government intervention. Governments can intervene by correcting externalities, and what basically their action, their policy, what they're trying to do is to internalize the costs associated to the externality, so these negative externality. How to price carbons? Well, there are basically two families of policies. In relation to environmental policy and environmental management, command and control policies relying on prescribing rules and standards and using sanctions to enforce compliance with these policies. Typically, command and control regulation requires polluters to meet specific emission reduction targets, and often requires the installation and use of specific type of equipment in order to reduce pollution, in order to reduce emissions. On exactly the opposite side of the spectrum of these two families of policies, we have market-based policies. And these type of instruments correspond to the attempt to use basically markets. So you use price as in a tax or a subsidy, or you try to use other economic instruments that eventually will provide incentives for polluters to reduce or even eliminate the negative environmental externalities. By the way, here you've got a few hyperlinks to some documents, some papers that you might be interested in reading if you are keen to know more about these two families of policies. So perhaps the most natural question that one could ask is, which is better? Should I go for a tax? Should I go for a carbon market? Should I go for a carbon tax where the price is fixed? Or should I go for a system where the quota is fixed and the price varies? The very key difference is when you fix the tax, when you fix the tax levels, the quota, the quantity that you will be obtaining under that particular tax level is uncertain, whereas with a cap and trade, with a carbon market, the quota, the quantity is certain, is the price that will be that is uncertain. And the price, as you can see here in the figure on the slide, this particular blue line represent the spot permit price from 2008 to 2021. This price just fluctuates, reflecting what is the level of supply and level of demand of those of the permits in the system. By the way, today the price is above 50 euro per ton of CO2. And here you already, I believe, recognize the financial and economic crisis in 2009 and the prolonged economic recession after 2012. So crucially, what you see here, and in contrast with a rigid tax rate, the price of emission permits, the price of allowances in a carbon market may be higher or lower in terms of price level, depending on what is the economic regime in which we are, depending on booming and low and downturn, sorry, of the economy. And this is exactly what is discussed in this paper, how to price carbon in good and bad times. So there is a lot of flexibility when you use carbon markets. Another key difference between a tax and a cap and trade is that a carbon tax can be easier in terms of implementation. Why? Well, because it's often uses the established channels of the tax system. And I believe this is not really a marginal aspect. In this way, by using the established channels, you are basically not required to design and implement new infrastructure for trading emission permits. That sometimes can be extremely complicated and certainly also costly. Whereas a carbon tax is more simple in terms of designing and implementation, a carbon market provides much more flexibility. Flexibility in terms of deciding when company should undertake abatement and how should undertake abatement. Okay, so having said that, who's pricing carbon around the world? The next two slides illustrate how wide is the adoption of carbon pricing, carbon taxes, and carbon markets, and the spread in the levels of the carbon tax rates and carbon prices. Everything is expressed in 2009 US dollar per ton of CO2. Here, as you can see, you identify already a relatively large number of jurisdictions, countries that implement carbon taxes, and the tax rate vary from a few dollars all the way to above $100 US in 2019 level for the case of Scandinavian countries. For carbon markets, we have two major, in fact, I would say three major regions currently implementing carbon markets. Europe with the European Emission Trading System, US, where we currently have the so-called Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative on the East Coast, the WCI, Western Climate Initiative on the West Coast, where you have California and Quebec joined together. That's the linkage I'll mention in a few slides. And China is obviously a very important player as well in the carbon market space. I'm referring here to two documents, the World Bank State and Trends of Carbon Pricing 2020. They just published the 2021 version, and the ICAP 2021. These two documents, they provide a comprehensive discussion and explanation of how the different systems differ and how they've been performing in the past. To be noted that also Russia is rolling out a new domestic voluntary carbon offset rules, and is considering extending its embryonic emission trading system, very much in response of the possibility of having to deal with a carbon border adjustment measure. Okay, so it is probably not too difficult to imagine how a carbon tax works, pretty much like any other tax systems. Rates are selected and tax exemption might be introduced to mitigate the cost effect. Now, what I would like to do is to spend a couple of minutes to describe the setup of a carbon market through the lenses of the European Union Emission Trading System, also known as EU ETS. All other ETSs or other programs working in a similar way. First, upstream versus downstream regulation. Where do you stop regulating your industries? At the moment, 45% of total emission in Europe are regulated under the EU ETS. This pretty much corresponds to the largest industrials in EU and also the electricity sectors. The rest of the emissions are attributable to transport, building and residential emissions and smaller industries. At the moment, these lasts are not regulated under the EU ETS, so these are usually referred to as non-ETS sectors. Second, how would you decide the cap? Well, the cap is basically how much you want to reduce your total emission. Compared to 2005 emission, the 2020 target, and you have this on the top right of the illustration, the 2020 target is a minus 20% with respect to 2005 emission, and recently decided minus 55% in 2030 emission compared to 2005. Now, moving to the lower right quadrant, these represent how you want to distribute the cap, how you want to distribute the effort in time. These particular illustrations represent the so-called linear reduction factor. The linear reduction factor is nothing more than a reflection of how you will allocate permits in time. And this is pretty much decreasing in linear fashion. So what basically that this illustration implies is that you are going to make the system systematically and continuously more stringent, more ambitious. There will be basically less permits in the future compared to present. So how does the carbon market work in practice? Well, permits are allocated to regulated entities. The default method of allocation of permits changed from grandfathering, meaning free allocation, to auctioning. In fact, just a few handful of sectors, just one main sector, the electricity sector, is completely covered under the auction provisions. Other sectors still receive, industrial sectors still receive free allocation, and I'll mention why is that in a couple of slides. Trading, well, that consists in transaction of permits from those entities that are characterized by higher abatement costs. So they are basically the buyers, to those entities that are typically characterized by lower abatement costs. So you basically have the ones that can do more in terms of abating, in terms of changing technology, in terms of changing the business. They will be able to do that, saved permits, and sell those permits into the markets, and sell those permits to those industries, those companies, those firms that are unable to undertake similar abatement measure, or those companies that simply think that the current price, the price at which they will buy permits, is cheaper than undertaking any sort of technological improvement or abatement. Now, there is a general agreement in the literature that carbon pricing can increase production costs, relative to jurisdiction, relative to those countries that do not apply carbon pricing policies. And these obviously could generate negative competitive issues and possibly result in carbon leakage. What I mean by carbon leakage, well, this is basically the risk that domestic production, shifts offshore to those countries with less stringent climate policies. So what is the cause of the risk? Well, if a firm in one jurisdiction has to pay for its emission, the pollution that there is a byproduct, that is the byproduct of the production, via whatever type of carbon pricing system, a tax, or because the company has to purchase permits, well, its production cost increase relative to competitors in other jurisdictions that maybe are not regulated under similar or equivalent measure. This might obviously reduce the market share of the firms that are subject to carbon pricing, and increase the market shares of their competitors outside the domestic carbon pricing system. Now, it is important to recognize that competitiveness, the impact of competitiveness, is quantifiable as carbon leakage only if there are three conditions simultaneously fulfilled. First, carbon pricing should be asymmetric. So firms, competitors do not face a similar ambitious carbon price or a similar ambitious policy. Emission shift to a region with less ambitious carbon pricing regimes. And last, production shift to a firm with a higher emission intensity. So you can claim you are in a situation where you do see carbon leakage, if that particular shift of production is happening towards a region that doesn't implement equivalent type of measure, and also to a firm that has a higher level of carbon intensity compared to the firm that was previously producing that particular good or service. Now, within this framework, there is the risk of carbon leakage is typically focused on energy intensive, carbon intensive, trade intensive industrial sectors. Why is that? So why just concentrating on these particular sectors? Well, because they usually tend to be the ones that are exposed to international competition, and they are considered to produce emissions that are hard to abate, basically. The technologies may be available, but extremely expensive to implement. Okay, so so far, carbon leakage concern, the risk of negative competitive issues. These type of concerns have been addressed by largely shielding the industries from the impact of carbon prices. The empirical evidence that we have suggests that current carbon policies have had little impact on leakage. And here I'm referring to a couple of papers that do a comprehensive analysis of the impact of the effect of carbon pricing on companies and on companies' performance and costs. There are, as I mentioned at the beginning in the agenda, there are design mechanisms that can mitigate the risk of leakage to some extent. One solution is a production incentive that basically distributes free allowances to polluting resources. So the idea is basically, I give you free allowances, you don't have to go on the market and buy them. So I mitigate or reduce the cost pressure on you. And you should, in theory, that would allow you to remain cost competitive relative to your competitors. A second approach would be to expand the footprint of the cap and of the cap and trade program, meaning having more sectors regulated under the same system, or equally important, to link the program, the domestic program, to non-domestic programs that will allow equalizations of cost. For example, within the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, Virginia, the state of Virginia in the US, will join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in 2021. And that basically, by integrating a new state within the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the potential competitiveness issues faced by neighboring, the industries in the neighboring states will be mitigated. A third approach that will be discussed by Andres is border adjustment. But basically, we require, with a border adjustment, the government, the state, a particular region requires product imports to be subject to the cap. And I will now review them in turn. So the current solution is free allocation. Free allocation meaning I'm giving out permits for free. Obviously, that amount of permits does not cover the entire emission. We're just talking about the percentage of emission produced by certain energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors. A certain percentage will be allocated for free. The current solution, free allocation, may have provided adequate protection against leakage, while carbon pricings were relatively low, so in the past, but it doesn't obviously support long-term carbon investment in going forward. And I would say also nor does it provide robust leakage protection going forward. So at the moment, other policies are considered. Okay, so let me say something about free allocation. What exactly do I mean with that? So in the European Union emission trading system, but equally in many other systems, free allocation where free allocation of allowances were generously allocated in phase 1 at the very beginning of the system, and also phase 2. So this is usually the case when you're starting a program. You want to have strong buy-in from the regulated sectors, from the regulated industries. So you give permits out for free. And if you look at the two graphs here, the two illustrations, one tells you pretty much which are the sectors that are considered to be energy intensive and trade exposed. And the second picture tells you something about, provides an overview, tells you something about the situation of export, the share of import and export of production for 9 energy intensive industrial sector, comparing the situation in 2008 and 2018. I wouldn't take this as an absolute proof. This is just an illustration, but the tendency, the direction of this result is that we do have a overall no sign of deteriorating competitiveness in relative import and export position. However, a real full-fledged analysis is required, where a consideration of what exactly goes into the equation that tells you what are the elements, what are the items that you need in your production is required. The second mechanism that I mentioned earlier is ETS expansion and linkage. Andreas very eloquently presented the case of very ambitious goals set by the Green Deal. Within these goals, the Commission is considering the implementation of an encompassing carbon pricing mechanism that covers all relevant sectors. Why is that? Well, if you see the illustration on your right-hand side, you would understand that while sectors like the electricity generation sector and some industries have been decreasing their emission, in particular the electricity sectors, because the electricity sector has technology that can be reduced. The other sectors, especially the non-ETS sector, were not able to reduce that prominently their emissions. So ideally, the best would be the implementation of a uniform carbon pricing, and that's the ultimate objectives, but potentially quite complicated. And everything, obviously, all these in order to equalize cost and distribute the share of abatement. What about linkage? What about interconnection? Well, the idea here is to allow the different systems, allow the different program to interconnect. Interconnection means ultimately price convergence, and if you have a price convergence, you will contribute to a level playing field. You will basically alleviate competitiveness concern among the different economies regulated under the different systems. This is, for example, what happened when the Swiss systems was integrated within the European system. The Norwegian system was integrated under the European system. The California and Quebec integrated price convergence. Price convergence obviously completely makes the competitiveness issue moot, not an issue anymore. Okay, so very brief overview of carbon border adjustment mechanism. Andreas will definitely tell us more about this later. The carbon border adjustment mechanism works basically by imposing a fee on carbon intensive goods from countries with less stringent climate policies. As I said, all these different mechanisms, all these different policies are designed and implemented in order to mitigate the potential risk of carbon, of a competitiveness issue and carbon leakage. So by imposing this adjustment, what you would like to do is you equalize costs and you contribute to a level play field. Ideally, all goods in the EU would face the same carbon price. So ideally, you should apply this adjustment to all goods that are imported in Europe and that obviously have been produced with a certain associated carbon amount. Now, limiting the border carbon adjustment to applying only to imports does not really address the distortion that is caused by domestic policies versus the fact that non-domestic other countries are basically not implementing similar or equivalent policies. So it's a theoretical possibility. I hardly believe this will be implemented, but possibly EU companies could receive a refund at the border when exporting their goods. As I said, I want to reemphasize, I think this is just I would say an interesting academic exercise to showcase how costs could be equalized domestically and how costs could be equalized non-domestically. I hardly believe that eventually there will be a refund system put in place when goods produced in Europe would be exported. Now, just a few words in terms of what are the implications of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, looking at the case of the UK post-Brexit. So I'm referring to analysis done by colleagues at the London School of Economics at the Grantham Research Institute. They looked at the different key sectors that will be affected by carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And in particular, they've been considering steel, aluminium, plastic, but also paper and cement. And they've been considering two possible scenarios. One, so-called narrow CBAM that covers only raw materials, and another one, broad scenarios that cover both raw materials and semi-finished products. Now, considering starting with the narrow CBAM, the raw materials like steel, aluminium, and plastic sectors would face quite hefty tax liabilities in the order of 600, almost 200, approximately 200 and 170 million as a tax per year, basically per export. If you do broaden that coverage from a narrow CBAM to a broad CBAM, the tax liability across steel, aluminium, and plastic are higher, but remain pretty much the same for paper and cement. That tells immediately that a narrow CBAM capture almost all material that are at risk of leakage in the cement and paper. So quite significant number, in particular for the steel sector. Okay, so let me conclude by drawing on some high level recommendation for the UK and try to crystallize these for the crystallize some takeaways for the case of Belarus. So what is the really important from the perspective of the UK is to have a robust carbon pricing framework. And this is not just needed to being able to support the UK deep decarbonization, but more importantly, to have a consistent framework with carbon policies of commercial and trade partners. And this, I think, speaks directly to the case of Russia already considering to expand their embryonal emission trading system. You want to have already in place a set of policy, a robust carbon pricing framework that allows you to interface with your commercial and trade partners. Linking, strengthening collaboration, maybe through linking is certainly viability, a possibility. By collaborating, you obviously mitigate potential economic impact related to import and export, and that's exactly the case of the UK, for example. Certainly for UK, much easier. We were part of the European emission trading system. Now UK has a standalone emission trading system, but this particular emission trading system is basically a copycat of the previous European system. So linking, integration, very simple, very easy, if you obviously abstract from political aspects. And last, that I think is very relevant also for the case as a takeaway for Belarus, it is clearly necessary to engage multilateral cooperation in order to avoid the potential risk to become a rule taker. So the very fact that you might have a trading partner significantly larger compared to you that has implemented already a set of policies, and you wanted to continue that trade relation in order to avoid to simply capture, in order to just simply avoid the possibility to just become a rule taker, multilateral engagement, multilateral cooperation and engagement would allow you to design policies that are more catered for your system. And I'm pretty sure that this will be referred again in the next presentation. Okay, with that, I conclude and I thank you.
Лука, спасибо большое за доклад. Хочется дополнить, что для стран, которые только приступают к разработке, внедрению механизмов углеродного регулирования, углеродных рынков, крайне важной актуальной задачей является определение оптимальной модели национального регулирования с учетом лучших зарубежных практик, например, практики Европейского Союза. И при этом очень важно понимать, что национальная система углеродного регулирования должна играть не только фискальную функцию, то есть не только являться неким дополнительным налоговым бременем на предприятия реального сектора, промышленности, энергетики, но и должна предусматривать систему финансовых стимулов для долгосрочных инвестиций в крупных отраслях эмиттеров парниковых газов. Уважаемые коллеги, сейчас у нас есть порядка 10 минут в конце первой части нашего вебинара для возможности задать вопросы нашим спикерам. Если есть вопросы у кого-то из нашей аудитории, просьба поднять руку в чате, и тогда наш администратор системный позволит вам включить микрофон и, соответственно, задать вопрос. Коллеги, если у кого-то есть вопрос. Если вопросов нет, я так понимаю, наши...
Простите. Да, у меня есть несколько вопросов. К Луке, больше теоретически, наверное. Are there any current measures available to deal with carbon leakage that the EU uses at the moment? It was the first question. Second question would be, are there any preferences to use non-market-based mechanism over market-based mechanism? And the last question is, what is it better, to fix the price of allowances or to fix the quantity of allowances? Thank you.
Do you mind repeat the first one, Irina? I was just didn't manage to catch the very first question.
Are there any current measures available that the EU are using right now to deal with the carbon leakage?
Yeah. Okay. So in the reverse order, maybe. Which one is best? Price versus quantity. And connected also to your second question, whether there are, in a way, toolkit that you can use to identify the best policy to be implemented. As I was referring at the beginning, I would immediately distinguish the two systems of fixing a price or fixing a quota as dictated by the two starking differences that are: you fix a price, but you don't know exactly how you will, what is the quantity that you will be achieving in terms of reduction. If you are comfortable with that, if you prefer to have a certainty on the cost that you will be imposing in a way on companies, that probably should be your preferred system. Conversely, if your aim, your objective is, I want to have full certainty about the quantity I will be regulating, the quantity I will be reducing, there are measures that could be taken into account in order to mitigate associated cost, but then a quantity is your should be your preferred instrument. In terms of toolkits, the World Bank recently published I think I would say a very thorough guidelines on what are the different elements, institutionals, economic, and policy elements, the bundle of these elements that should be considered before designing any system. And I would highly recommend that publication. I'll definitely look it up and post the link in the chat at the end of the Q&A. Based on that, for example, with colleagues at the London School of Economics, we did do an analysis for Taiwan, and we helped the Taiwanese Environmental Protection Agency to distinguish between these two options, price and quantity, tax and cap and trade and carbon market, which one is the best for the Taiwanese case. And again, you might not be surprised, but the tax turns out to be the most suitable system for the context, economic, environmental, and policy of Taiwan. And last, does the European Union have carbon leakage mitigation measure? Yes, obviously, there are. The current one that Europe has is free allocation. So the idea of I am partially mitigating the associated risk of negative competitiveness by allocating a fraction of allowances for free. So again, I think it's very important to understand that not all emissions are given out for free to industries. A fraction of that amount of emission that cover what the industry is emitting is free. The rest, industry has to go on the market and buy it. At the moment, this is the only measure that Europe is implementing. CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment measure, is an alternative measure currently discussed, and if implemented, will very likely replace any other policy.
Thank you.
Thank you. И если позволите, еще несколько вопросов, которые Андреасу и Луке мне хотелось бы задать. Коллеги, есть ли в настоящее время некое исследование либо комплексные оценки, каким образом развитие системы углеродного налога, системы торговых выбросов, CBM-механизма повлияли на рост конкурентоспособности европейской промышленности? Ну, например, на такие показатели, как рост добавленной стоимости, рост объемов экспорта, либо снижение объемов импорта продукции промышленности, численности рабочих мест. То есть есть ли некие макроэкономические оценки, которые позволили бы странам, как, например, Беларусь, Россия, Украина, понимать, каковы затраты, самое главное, выгоды от внедрения подобных механизмов? Спасибо. Лука, Андреас, кто-нибудь из вас, если можно, прокомментируйте.
I'm happy to leave that to Luca because it's about research, and I think he's better than I am.
Very, very happy to take it, Andreas. There are several papers that explore the impact of carbon pricing on the economy as a wider element of analysis, so macroeconomic analysis, but there are also several papers that study the impact of carbon pricing on labor productivity, on general outputs variables. So again, I'm very happy to post on the chat some link. In fact, there is a very recent paper by two American scholars that explore the impact, historically, the impact of the European carbon pricing on, I believe, three key economic outputs: labor, GDP, and I suspect is another TFP, the total factor productivity, an element of productivity of the system. So I'll post that as well. Studies that consider the impact of implementing a carbon border adjustment, they do exist. A German professor, I would say, is one of the most experienced on that aspect. However, most of those studies are ex ante studies, meaning simulations. They're not really testing using data, because in a way, a CBAM never really existed. Has not really implemented. So they do simulate, they do analyze the potential consequences of the implementation of these type of policies. And again, very happy to post, Ivan, very happy to post that in the chat, if it's okay with you.
Thank you very much. Спасибо большое. И еще тогда небольшой вопрос, если позволите. А вот каким образом Carbon Border Adjustment механизм согласуется с правилами и нормами Всемирной торговой организации? Потому что Республика Беларусь находится на завершающем этапе вступления в ВТО, и хотелось бы понимать, насколько вот эти новые механизмы, которые будут запущены Европейским Союзом, начиная с 2021-2022 года, могут изменить те правила международной торговли, к которым в настоящее время вот готовятся страны, такие как Беларусь. То есть насколько серьезными будут эти изменения и не нарушает ли этот механизм CBM нормы ВТО? Если есть вот информация, можете ли ей поделиться? Спасибо.
Short answers. I'm sorry about that. I'm no legal scholar or legal expert. Short answer is no, I don't think so. But again, I would be more comfortable in referring to two scholars that are really trade experts, legal scholar and trade expert. Michael Melling is one. I think Michael in particular has two recent papers precisely addressing these points. The implications of carbon border adjustment from a trade legal perspective, and the compatibility or incompatibility of the CBAM with the WTO agreement.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, if I may, I will address that briefly in my presentation, but the bottom line is the EU has obviously a vast number of trade lawyers at their disposal who will have reviewed this and put it through an assessment about, or will put whatever they propose, which isn't quite clear yet, through an assessment that will point out where all the pitfalls are lying. So I can't comment on what the legality of something is that we haven't actually seen yet, but I think what will happen is that countries will challenge it in the WTO. That I think is pretty much a given. I think if the EU has done their homework, and also based on what Luca just said, I expect that it will take a few years to resolve, but it won't delay the introduction, and ultimately it won't fundamentally change the outcome. So there may well be aspects of the system that will not be WTO compliant, but I'm pretty certain that whatever the EU will propose in July will be at a fundamental level WTO compliant and will survive any challenge. So it'll take, I mean, it will certainly take years to sort it out. There'll be lots of money for lawyers in the process, but ultimately it's going to come. And the WTO is not going to rescue you.
Andres, thank you. I can see that Vladislav raised his hand. Vladislav, вы можете задать вопрос?
Hello, Luca, Andreas, and everyone else. I'd like to say thank you for the presentation. And I have a more commercial-oriented question. So, say, does Belarus and Belarusian producers, which are which will be subject to the payment of the carbon border tax or some kind of carbon border adjustment mechanism, is there a way for them to become exempt of the carbon border adjustment mechanism? So is joining the EU ETS such a way, or is creation of a national system of emission trading such a way to become exempt? And is there a mechanism in the EU of assessment of how good a national system of emission trading should be to become exempt of the carbon border adjustment?
So maybe I'll try, Andreas. I know that you've got a couple of slides in your presentation, but I think that at the moment there's no clear. So at the moment in the design of the CBAM, potential exemption from CBAM, the wording is equivalent measure, and this equivalent measure is something that obviously needs to be defined properly. So I would expect that clearly a straightforward exemption is my system and your system are perfectly integrated. That's an exemption, meaning that I will never implement any sort of extra distortionary measure at the border because our two systems are perfectly integrated. So that to me is the easiest way of avoiding the CBAM. That's precisely what the UK is exploring. In order to avoid any sort of debate about the definition of equivalent measure, you can argue forever about mine is more ambitious than yours in terms of program. The UK system, the UK emission trading system, will be the ideal scenario is the UK system will be linked to the European system. Exemption, no need of any sort of extra CBAM or whatever type of measure at the border. Other exemptions at the moment, I understand, are purely speculative and based on this idea of if you do implement an equivalent measure or a sufficiently ambitious measure, you might be subject to a different level of adjustment. But maybe Andreas knows much more better the legal wording around this.
Okay, I hope this translates into Russian, but I don't know how many of you have ever seen a medieval drawing of an elephant. Yeah, so they're actually very funny. So if you go onto Google and you look for medieval drawing of an elephant and what people in 1300 thought elephants looked like, because I never seen one. They had descriptions. It's a big animal. It's got a trunk and it's got a tail and two tusks, and the pictures are really, really funny. Because we obviously know what an elephant looks like. So this is the situation that we're in essentially in this seminar. So we're trying to draw an elephant based on some fairly rough descriptive elements. Yeah, so it's going to be based on carbon. It's it has to be WTO compliant and all of that. And now we're left to coloring all of this in, and quite frankly, it's going to whatever we say here. It's going to look roughly like the elephant. It's not going to look exactly like what an elephant looks like in the end. So we really need to wait until July to understand what exactly it is they're proposing. So with that said, I think there clearly needs to be a provision for mitigating measures to count. Yeah, so there's no way around that under WTO rules. I think it would be that's my personal opinion. I'm not a lawyer either, but I think if you end up charging for carbon content in a product that's going into the EU, where the carbon content has already been paid for in the jurisdiction that it comes from, I'm pretty certain you'll end up in the discriminatory bucket, and it's not going to be WTO compliant. So if you have an ETS, if you have a carbon tax, any other form of levy, then I think the EU is unlikely to charge either the full cost, depending on what it is, or indeed anything at all. I would expect that for some countries at least, the EU is going to try an exemption as well, particularly developing countries. That's going to be interesting to see that. That's going to be much more difficult. But for example, if, let's say, eventually there was a carbon border adjustment mechanism for agricultural products, then I could well see that apply to Ukraine, while they're trying not to apply to, let's say, Uganda or Kenya. Yeah, because they're considered developing countries, they need preferential treatment, they need support, so therefore they're being given a pass, or they will try to give them a pass, while Ukraine is at a different scale of development, not going to get a pass. And these are the sort of very detailed questions that we will then have to consider when they propose whatever they propose. But yes, I think mitigating measures, the easiest would obviously be, sure, join the European Union emissions trading system. You know, job done, that's it. At that point, you would no longer face the border adjustment mechanism, because there's nothing to adjust. You're already accounting at the same level as a company inside the EU does. Yeah, but obviously that has lots of other challenges that related to jurisdiction, sovereignty, the fact that you would join a system where you yourself have absolutely no decision-making capability, so you're just running along with whatever the EU does, and so it's not particularly attractive. I mean, the UK has decided that they don't want that; they wanted to have their own system for precisely those reasons. So that's the situation that we're in. We don't know what it's going to look like, but yeah, mitigating will be possible, I think.
Okay, thank you so much.
Andreas and Luca, thank you. Владислав, спасибо вам за вопрос. Предлагаю двигаться дальше. Комплексная политика Евросоюза, включая все составляющие зеленой сделки, направлена на преобразование экономики Европейского Союза с целью нейтрализации выбросов к 2050 году, где механизм трансграничного углеродного регулирования играет важную роль. Таким образом, детальная предварительная оценка последствий зеленой сделки Европейского Союза для белорусского экспорта в новых условиях весьма важна для следующего реагирования. И наша следующая секция посвящена механизму трансграничного углеродного регулирования, его влиянию на экспортеров, угрозы на уязвимые отрасли экономики, также необходимые меры и пути сокращения углеродоемкой продукции и потенциальных действий правительства. Хочу отметить, что в 11:50 с 11:50 до 12 часов у нас запланирован перерыв. Андреас, передаю вам слово.
Thank you so much. I will share my screen again, so let me know if that works.
The presentation is visible.
Right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Silence is never good. Okay. Right, Irina, can you see my screen? Oh, you're probably on the other channel.
First slide.
The first slide of your presentation is on the screen.
1 second. Sorry, because of the translations, I cannot hear your responses. So let me just quickly go back into Zoom. Perfect. Okay, very good. Then that's it. That's what I needed to know. Right, there we go. Right, well, thank you very much. And we are now going to go through what the carbon border adjustment is, what I expect it will do, and what companies can do to protect themselves from its impacts. So let's start. So the presentation consists of 4 parts in total. We have a break in between. The first section is what is a carbon border adjustment mechanism, how does it affect importers, and what are the vulnerable sectors in Belarus. And then the second one is what exporters can do to reduce their exposure. And then a little bit on potential government actions to support exporters, and then I will sum up. And after that, I believe we have an opportunity for questions. Right, so what is a carbon border adjustment mechanism? This is a selection of headlines from, well, they go back about 9 months or so, probably a bit less than that. But you can see that going from pretty much nowhere to it being an almost daily matter in the news, the carbon border adjustment mechanism has followed a similar trajectory to Lady Gaga's career. And now everybody is dealing with this and trying to figure out what it will be, which sectors will be affected, and how it's going to impact on exports to the EU. So why is this being proposed? Well, the issue is that the very high CO2 prices, or relatively high, historically high CO2 prices that we're seeing in the EU ETS right now, make energy-intensive industries, so steel, fertilizer, chemicals, less competitive inside the EU than outside the EU. So that means that companies inside the EU can save money by ordering the same product from outside the EU. The tariffs that might be imposed on it, if there's a tariff, is not sufficient to cover this differential. And this is technically referred to as carbon leakage, as Luca pointed out. So, because it means that carbon leaks out of the EU system, where EU emissions trading system, where it's being controlled and managed, to countries where there is no control and management. There is another aspect to that, and that is that because the EU emissions trading system has been in operation for about 17 years now, companies inside the EU have reacted to that. They've invested in efficiency, they've invested in fuel switching, they've invested in procuring renewable energy supply. And they're actually quite efficient in terms of an energy input basis. And the issue is that companies outside the EU aren't as efficient, so they have much higher carbon emissions in many cases. But because they don't have to pay for them, it doesn't matter. So they add this very big differential to their overall competitiveness and make it easy to undercut companies inside the EU. And this has become a major concern in the EU. So the idea is that a border levy on similar products, such as, let's say, rolled steel, that is raised from the exporter when the product crosses into the EU, restores the equilibrium of competition, and then allows competition on other aspects, such as quality, service, scale, rather than exploiting a regulatory advantage. So this is primarily an issue at the moment for industries with high energy input or process emissions. And I don't expect that it will go much beyond that in the first instance. And so it's also important to note that I would expect the carbon border adjustment mechanism to be in addition to existing tariffs. So it's not replacing them. It's not going to be, discounted against them. It's going to be on top of those. So there's strong support in the EU for a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and the view is that if it's not introduced in the EU, jobs will be lost, the EU will deindustrialize, and the climate objectives of the EU will not be achieved because, as I noted, outside the EU, less efficient producers will emit more CO2 making the same goods, which are then transported over longer distance, again, causing more CO2 emissions to reach the EU. So, I'm sorry, there's a typo here. So the energy intensive industries in particular, they don't levy, they lobby heavily to to address this, this imbalance, and they want to have a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So Franz Timmermans, a few days ago, he noted that this carbon leakage and the threat that it implies to EU industries is an existential question for the EU. And nobody in the EU wants to deindustrialize. One of the biggest EU countries, actually the biggest EU country, Germany, has a very strong industrial base, and there's a lot of pressure coming from that. So in my view, the introduction of a carbon border adjustment mechanism is no longer a question of if it will happen, but it's now only a question of when it will happen. So why is Belarus exposed to this? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is Belarus's status. Belarus, like all the EU countries, is an Annex I country under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so it won't get the privileges that might be extended to developing non-Annex I countries such as, Malawi, Peru, Argentina, and these are generally poorer countries. They are at a different level of development, and they get differential treatment and more preferential treatment. Secondly, proximity. I'm not a trade expert and I'm not a trade academic, but I understand enough about trade to know that there's a gravity effect. So the closer two countries are to each other, the more they trade with each other. Simply because it's easier, the cost of doing so is lower. For example, the transport cost, the time you need to invest to go on a business trip from let's say Minsk to Warsaw is much, much shorter than the time it takes you to go from Minsk to, let's say, Bangkok. Yeah, so it's easier to trade. And therefore, more trade is being done with the EU than with, other similar jurisdictions. And therefore, Belarus is quite exposed. And then structure. Like many post-Soviet countries, Belarus has a structure that is very much based on heavy industry, very energy-intensive industries as well. So there's a lot of metal bashing, oil refining, chemicals, all things that use a lot of energy. And also there's a legacy of the Soviet times, which is that the whole system is quite energy inefficient. So Belarus isn't as bad as some of the other post-Soviet countries, but it's also not particularly great. And this means that products such as steel from Belarus, chemicals, any sort of metals, they come with a very high carbon content. So below you see the graphs. This is based on IEA numbers, and Belarus is about half. So Belarus is twice as inefficient as the EU is in on average. And just to note, the figure here, which is 0.76 for the EU, that's the average. There are countries in the EU that are sort of at 0.12, 0.15, 0.2, quite a few of them. Denmark is probably the world leader in terms of efficiency per GDP. And they're very close to 0.1, I think, from memory. So, so this average masks huge imbalances. So basically, Belarus may be 10 times more inefficient than quite a few EU countries. So then the next question that, when you're faced with any sort of problem and it's a bit difficult to solve it, the next question is going to be, can I get around it? So is it possible to circumvent the carbon border adjustment mechanism? Well, it may be in the first instance. It depends on which sectors are covered. But for example, if finished products aren't included, but intermediary products are. So for example, steel and aluminium is included, but cars are not. Yeah, so then you could export Belarusian steel to Ukraine. Ukraine manufactures a car. The car is being exported to Poland, but because cars aren't covered under the carbon border adjustment mechanism, nobody's going to ask where the steel comes from that went into it. So you've just circumvented the problem. But I'm coming back to the elephant analogy here. We don't know which sectors are going to be included. We don't know how finished products are going to be treated. We don't know how things are going to be accumulated, and therefore it's simply impossible to tell. So it might be possible to circumvent it, but even if it is, it will probably only be for a short time, because what happens with these sort of go-arounds is that they are often shut down quite quickly by additional regulatory action, because no regulator likes to see people play the system. So what do we know about it? Well, the target sectors are probably initially going to be carbon-heavy sectors, so power production, which isn't so much a problem for Belarus. Metals, cement, those are a problem because the carbon content in these products is easier to assess than it is in finished products or also in some other intermediate products. However, as always in the EU, there's a lot of political pressure going on, and I've seen at least one call already for agriculture to be included. So there may be fertilizers, there may be chemicals. Chemicals are tricky though, because I mean, chemicals, it's a vast range of things, and it's not quite clear how you would do this on a product level. I mean, steel is much easier. So there may be other sectors added to it, depending on the lobbying. There may not be. Difficult to tell. It will depend on what's going to happen after the proposals have been published. So the timeline, I thought when I wrote this that the legislative proposal would come next month. I've now seen it might come in July, but it's going to come very soon regardless. And then there are some expectations that, this is going to be one of those things where the EU Commission has an ambitious policy and then the member countries shoot it down. That could happen. I just don't see why. This is a policy that is beneficial to every EU member state. And there isn't an obvious drawback that I could see for any EU member state. So I really don't see why a single EU member state would sit down and oppose it. It might happen, but I just don't think it will. And I think this is one of those policies that will be adopted relatively quickly and implemented relatively quickly because the competitive pressure and the lobbying pressure is so high. And basically anyone who's right now facing an election inside the EU will want this to come as quickly as possible. So what else do we know about it? Well, we discussed WTO compliance already, and that gives us a little bit of insight. So it will not be possible for the EU to use this as a trade barrier. So if another country has a similar mechanism, the goods should be able to pass without levy or with a reduced levy, depending on the nature of the mechanism. And my understanding, again, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that the revenues cannot be used to subsidize affected industries inside the EU. They can be used to support general clean growth, sustainability, support for renewables maybe. They may, as Luca pointed out, it may be possible to use them to reimburse exporters from the EU. So let's say that ThyssenKrupp pays for the EU ETS, and they export a certain amount of their steel to a jurisdiction that doesn't have carbon pricing. So they're getting exposed competitively to other steel makers who can offer a lower price. Maybe if they can show to the EU that the goods pass outside the EU, they will be reimbursed any money they paid on EU emission allowances to produce the goods in the first instance. That's not clear, but it's certainly a possibility. So that would mean there's also an effect on Belarusian exports from that corner, because suddenly, for example, EU exports of steel to Ukraine would be more competitive than they were before. But on the whole, we don't know enough about it yet. We don't know what the structure is. We don't know how they would calculate the price or the levy itself. We don't know which sectors it applies to. We don't know what would be an appropriate mitigation action in a third country like Belarus. So how does carbon border adjustment mechanism affect exporters? This is a bit of a sort of technical discussion. So the carbon content of a product is a function of the product itself, what it is, the location where it's made, and the process, how it is made. So for example, if you look at products, you could have electric arc versus blast furnace steel. The electric arc has much less carbon content than blast furnace because no coal is being used in its production. You're using scrap steel, which is easier to handle. Location. Well, Norway has almost 100% renewable electricity, and Poland has, I don't know, probably by now about 80% coal electricity. Both Norway and Poland produce aluminium. Aluminium is very electricity intensive to produce, so it's quite clear that Norwegian aluminium is much lower carbon content than Polish aluminium. And process, well, if you think about cement, the old method of cement was that you had a wet kiln. This has been in many countries and many operations now being transformed to a dry kiln. In a wet kiln, you have to expend more energy to dry the limestone, and therefore it's a more energy intensive process and you emit more CO2. So combinations of these three are, in fact, not just possible, but they are also quite likely. Yeah, so if you imagine you have electric arc furnace steel being produced in Norway, that's primarily using renewable electricity, that's very low carbon content. So the carbon border adjustment mechanism then should be a function of two things. One is the carbon content, and the second one is the cost of CO2 allowances in the EU ETS. I've used the example of BMZ Steel. That's a Belarusian outfit that most of you will be familiar with. The latest figures I've seen from them are that they exported 925,000 tons of steel to the EU. There may be steel and metal products, but let's just presume it's all steel. Steel has about 2 tons of CO2 content per ton of steel. And if the price of the carbon border adjustment mechanism is set at the price of the EU ETS, well, then BMZ Steel now has to pay a border levy of over 100 million euros in order to export that steel to the EU. So that's a sizable amount of money, and it will certainly diminish the competitiveness of BMZ Steel inside the EU. So you can see what that looks like here. I've used the example of steel. I've just assumed some numbers on the transport costs because I've got no idea how much it costs to transport a ton of steel to some point inside the EU. But as you can see, essentially right now, even with slightly higher transport costs, BMZ Steel, if it's the same sort of world market price of 570 euros per ton, which is again a number that is based on an average of various steel products, then BMZ Steel is cost competitive inside the EU because the competing EU producer has to pay a carbon levy. And the moment that you impose the CBAM, that's it. You know, the higher transport costs essentially make BMZ Steel uncompetitive. So that is the issue that is being faced here by exporters. So Belarus's most vulnerable sectors. Now I have to apologize here. This is something that I've based on the best figures that I could find and a range of assumptions. So don't take the numbers here as the ultimate truth. What they are is they are an indication, and they give you an idea also on how to approach this, but the actual numbers will be different. So how vulnerable are you as an exporter, or indeed as Belarus as a country? So, well, the question is, how much carbon is in your product? and how much of your product ends up in the EU. So there's a range of uncertainties. You know, we don't know what the level is, we don't know the sectors, we don't know what the mitigation potential is, and we don't know how finished products are being treated, as I noted. So let's go through some of the vulnerable sectors. Metals. I already mentioned the BMZ example. So the figures I could find is that the EU 27 account for just over a third of the metals exports of Belarus. The total value of exports is 665 million. I have to apologize, there's a slight error here, but it doesn't affect the basic message. So if we assume 570 euros per ton of the exported metal, the exported value is 1,246,000 tons. So the annual carbon border adjustment mechanism is 137 million euros, or about 19% of the value of the exported product. That's quite a sizable amount of money, and it's something that is almost certainly going to have an impact on the competitiveness. Cement is a lot worse because cement has a very high carbon content per ton of CO2. So and a relatively, sorry, it doesn't, so it's different. Cement has a much lower price, which means that the carbon content is quite high in comparison to the price. So therefore, the share of the export value that is being affected in the case of cement is almost 60%, and that is a problem. So the lower value your product is, the more impact the CO2 share or the carbon content of the product will have. That's just a given. There's nothing you can do about it. And so the most vulnerable products are low value, high carbon products. So if you go through the range of exports that you have and you have a look at that, then you need to understand how much carbon is in it, how much money do I get for every ton I export to the EU. You know, if you get a lot of money for it, then you can deal with a high carbon price. But if you get a relatively small amount of money, then the carbon price is going to kill you. There's no doubt about that. So, and you see the opposite effect here when we look at fertilizer, because fertilizer has a relatively low carbon content. So even though it's a relatively lower value product than metals, it can survive even even this relatively lower value. And the share of the export value that's affected, I've used potash fertilizer here, is only 5%. So that's much more survivable. So I wouldn't expect that fertilizer is going to be affected very much. But yeah, but the key question is always, what's it worth? How much carbon is in it? And if that relationship is inverse, low value, high carbon content, you're in trouble. High value, high carbon content, you're probably going to be okay. High value, low carbon content, you're almost definitely going to be okay. It's a marginal impact. Right, so what actions can exporters take in order to protect themselves?
Andreas,
so there are 3 actions that you can take as an exporter, not as a government, but as, oops, what just happened here? Yes,
Andreas,
okay, thank you,
yeah,
Irina.
Sorry, since you finished the first part and at the beginning of the second part, maybe we can take a break here as it was planned according to the agenda. So we'll be back at 11.
Ah, okay, so yes, you want to take a break now?
Yeah, for 10 minutes.
That's fine.
So we can start in 10 minutes with your second part of the presentation.
Okay, so we'll take the break now, and it's what, 10 minutes, I think. So we'll reconvene at 11:55 Minsk time, 9:55 UK time.
Yes, thank you. Уважаемые участники, мы сейчас возьмем кофе-паузу и вернемся в 11:55. Спасибо. 11:55, и мы возвращаемся к нашей второй секции. Андреас. Андреас, вы с нами?
I'm indeed. 1 second. Sorry. It's very nice to see the sun has come up, but it doesn't help with the video quality. So, right.
Beautiful weather in Minsk as well.
Come here.
Right. Let me see. Right, so we are moving into part 2 now, actions that can be taken by exporters. So quite clearly, this is not for the country itself. I come to the country actions later.
Andreas?
So there's sort of 3 fundamental actions. One is, you know.
Andreas, I'm sorry for interrupting. Can you please change the view of the presentation?
Oh, 1 second. Sorry, 1 moment. It's
on the left side.
Okay, I'm here.
We can see you. No presentation yet.
Oh, the presentation didn't show. Sorry about that. Let me see. Yeah. Can you see? Oh,
We can see.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Right, so there we are. So,
Thank you.
All right, I continue then, yeah. So we are now discussing what kind of actions can be taken by exporters. So just to be clear, that's not the government of Belarus, but really just the exporting companies. So there's 3 fundamental options. One is, well, you just accept the carbon border adjustment mechanism as a fact of life, and you pay every time you ship something to the EU. Second one is you try to avoid it, so you find other markets or you move production inside the EU. That's obviously not always very realistic. And the third one is you try to mitigate it, you reduce the carbon content of your products. So if you accept it, well, it's the least hassle and it requires no change to what you're doing right now, other than sending a lot of money to the EU every time you ship something there. The disadvantage of that is, you know, it's not going to make you more competitive, rather less so. So you're likely to lose market share. And the carbon border adjustment mechanism almost certainly needs to be paid in euros, so it will hit your foreign exchange reserve. You can avoid it. Yeah, so the advantages to that are, well, it's a bit like the global Britain discussion. You know, it broadens the export base of your company because you're now exporting to more countries. It makes your company overall probably more resilient to external shocks. Well, the disadvantage is, well, unless Belarus magically gets, you know, transported over to Asia, it's actually quite far away. Most places that aren't the EU, Russia, or Ukraine are quite far away from Belarus. So diversification isn't free. It will cost money. There are higher transport costs. The prices you realize in these markets may be lower, because you know, they're less wealthy. There are other competitors who may be cheaper, so that will eat into your margins. Some of the export destinations themselves may consider a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So the US is already talking about it, and Luca showed us before a map of countries that have carbon taxes or some form of carbon levy. Just today, Pakistan joined that group apparently, so they are now also on the map. So there are 2 things here. all of these countries are going to look at what's going to happen with the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. And then when it becomes clear that it's actually legal and it works and it has an impact, they are going to introduce one themselves. Yeah, so there's, I think, very little doubt in my mind that if the EU is successful with its adjustment mechanism, that the US or Pakistan or Kazakhstan won't say, yeah, actually, we can do the same thing. We will also protect our industries from being undercut by environmentally polluting, climate-destroying imports. What's not to like? So this is, that means avoid in many cases is a temporary measure, and the number of countries you can expect that it's going to work and it's going to diminish over time as more and more countries introduce carbon levies themselves. And then, you know, finally, setting up international production sites or new sales, it actually takes time. It isn't straightforward, and it's costly. So it's not necessarily the greatest way of dealing with the problem. And then you can mitigate. Well, mitigation has a number of advantages. So you modernize your operations, they become more efficient. There's a lot of potential for that in the industrial sector. It contributes to achieving the Paris Agreement commitments of Belarus. There are other ancillary benefits. You know, if you clean up your industrial production site, you're probably going to emit less pollution locally, so your neighbors may like you more. You will have to pay less fees for polluting the water, for polluting the air. And mitigation can also be based on local resources. You're investing locally, you're using locally produced energy and renewables. And so it improves also, or probably improves your foreign exchange balance as well. So the disadvantages are in Belarus, renewable resources are more costly. You know, I've only been to Minsk once, but the weather was horrible that time, I'm afraid. And in general, however, solar irradiation, sunshine in Belarus isn't quite the same as it is in Egypt. And therefore, solar PV produces less. It's inland, so there isn't a coastline where you could produce cheap offshore wind. And the main renewable resource is biomass, and biomass has its own problems because you're still burning things, which means you're still emitting CO2, and there's a lot of discussion around it. It also leads to deforestation, which also affects the overall carbon balance of your country. It's not free. You may have to invest quite a lot depending on how inefficient your production right now is, and it can't be achieved overnight. And then there's one point that I forgot to mention here, which is quite a big one, really. It depends also on how the carbon border adjustment mechanism is being introduced. If it's being, you know, if they look at the product as your product, then obviously doing something in your production side makes a difference. But if it's just an adjustment mechanism for a ton of steel from Belarus, then all steel producers in Belarus will have to pay the same levy regardless of how clean their steel is. So that's a question that hasn't been answered yet. Again, I would expect there might be WTO issues if you don't do it on a product basis, sorry, a production site basis, but I don't know is the honest answer. So it depends on what they eventually propose, and whatever happens after whatever they propose has been challenged in the WTO. But there is definitely an issue around that. So that's it. So then what are the paths to reducing emissions in industry? And again, let me reiterate, I consider, you know, I come from an energy efficiency background myself. I consider any action you undertake to improve the energy efficiency of your operations to be very advantageous, and it's something you should be doing in any case. So first of all, how can you mitigate things? Well, there are things that you can and you cannot affect as an industrial producer. So changing production processes, improving energy efficiency on site, well, that's under your control. reducing the average carbon content of the electricity that's powering your operation, that's probably outside your control. I mean, you could try to buy renewable energy, but it depends on whether it's even possible in Belarus that you have a direct contract like that. So the improvements to energy efficiency and reducing carbon content of industrial products is therefore based on two directions. One is system-wide, so something that's being done at sector level, at country level, and the other one is site-specific. So system-wide, we're looking at government actions. So these could be new policies, rules, and regulations. They could include, for example, minimum performance standards for motors, support for renewable energy production, energy efficiency policies, support to energy efficiency, and introduction of carbon pricing through sectoral or national ETS or carbon tax or some form of a levy. Site-specific, well, you know, this is how this works in my mind, at least. Yeah, you measure the carbon content, you measure the energy consumption of your product, you report it, you analyze the reports, you act, and then you measure again, and you do that all the time. Yeah, so, and the aim is always to improve and to continuously get better. So on-site actions, where you start by tracking energy use and carbon content, then you undertake energy audits to identify savings potentials, and there's quite a lot. About sort of 15 years ago, I was at a conference in Ireland, and I talked to an energy auditor from the industrial sector, and he said he doesn't even need to know which industrial site he goes to. He knows that he can probably save them about 1/3 of their energy consumption, you know, on a single or two visits. It's just a matter of fact that a lot of things in energy use in industry are very inefficient because it's never been a core consideration. So there's things like improved lighting, introduction of high efficiency motors, modernization of heating ventilation system, and also compressed air systems. So there's a lot of energy wastage in those, and the installation of on-site microgeneration, so very high efficiency microturbines that produce electricity and heat at the same time. They can be used for on-site steam generation, for example. They generally have efficiencies of about 90%, which pretty much beats whatever else you can think of. And then you draw up an investment plan based on the results of the energy audit. In order to do that, each unit and site needs to have an energy and carbon manager, and that person needs to be empowered to take action, to you know, to have a direct line really to management. So, and then many people say, well, yes, that's all very nice and well, but you know what, my operation is already as efficient as it can be. There's nothing else I can do. Well, this graph is from the IEA, and it shows the development of manufacturing energy intensity per unit of value added in Germany from 2000 to 2018. So if you look at it closely, the energy intensity over that period of time decreased by over a quarter. At the same time, the industry share in GDP increased by 1%. So the idea that reducing emissions and becoming more efficient can only be done by deindustrialization at the economy level is simply wrong. The Germans show quite clearly that you can do both. You can grow or maintain your industrial activity, and you can very substantially decrease the impact it has on carbon. And this is really, it's actually one of the big drivers of the overall decarbonization of Germany is, you know, the industrial improvement. It's not just the renewables in power production. Right, so corporate emissions reporting. That's another issue that, again, is quite closely linked to this, because unless you actually do this, if the EU says, okay, we're going to be site-specific with our carbon border adjustment mechanism, so the metalworks in Minsk are going to be assessed in their own right, and they're going to have a different carbon border adjustment mechanism from the metalworks in Vitebsk. then unless they do that, there won't be much of an impact of this. But if they do that, then it's absolutely critical. Then you need to be able to do this. There are a number of other good reasons why you should be doing it in any case, but on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, that's sort of where we are. So you need it, first of all, you need the reporting to be able to manage the carbon border adjustment exposure yourself. Without this reporting, you don't know how exposed you are, you don't know the risk, and you can't really identify the measures that you can use to mitigate your exposure. And there are now a lot of NGOs and external standards and reporting bodies. So the thing is, if you don't report properly yourself, someone else will do it for you, but they will apply their methodology, not yours, and you may not like the results. And we've just seen that a few days ago in the case of ExxonMobil, the oil company in the United States, where an external body reported on Exxon's corporate strategy and its compliance with the Paris Agreement. And the report was really absolutely disastrous, I think, for Exxon's corporate direction, and led to changes in the board. And not voluntary changes, so that was forced on the management. So this is an issue, report properly yourself and you're much less exposed to this kind of stuff. Reporting also has other benefits. So it raises the potential for investment by outside entities, so such as the EBRD, who have very high environmental and social standards, and they will look for, as part of their due diligence process, they will look very closely at what the impact of your operations is. It improves your own ability to manage what is a high cost factor, energy, much more closely, and increase or decrease its use, and therefore the cost of operations. And it identifies quite clearly the potential for modernization investment, so where that is most beneficial. There are other benefits that are softer, so your stakeholder relations will probably improve. It's going to be easier to work with the people around you. So corporate reporting on greenhouse gases, it's still at a relatively early stage. The UK has now introduced mandatory reporting. There's also an EU directive in that regard. And the auditors are gearing up to do this. So if you look, I think PricewaterhouseCoopers, they already have something on their website that they can help you do it. We have quite substantial experience on this kind of reporting from existing carbon market standards. So the Clean Development Mechanism has a long list of calculation methodologies that could be used. There's a gold standard, who have been very active in voluntary carbon markets. And these can all produce robust assessments of CO2 emissions at project level, so at site level. So they're useful actions that can be taken now. So to get there, well, you need to look which existing standard fits you best, and you need to then apply it at a level that could withstand an audit in terms of, so a quality level that could withstand an audit. So it needs to be done properly, and it needs to be trackable. It needs to be robust. You need to define what are the appropriate indicators, the most important drivers of energy use and carbon emissions in your operations. And it's going to be these two, mostly emissions from fuel use, and then the process emissions. They're called IPPU, industrial production process use, I think, in the United Nations language. And then reporting will enable you to look for alternative means of supplying yourself. And generally, it's probably a good idea to talk to your auditors and see how they can help you. But as noted, it's difficult to give you recommendations right now as to what you should apply. I think it's still very much an evolving area. There are sort of four different websites that I would recommend that you have a look at if you want to look at this at the technical level. The Climate Disclosure Standards Board, despite the name, it's actually it's an NGO. It's not an official body. The gold standard. They have a long experience, over a decade, in this field. The Carbon Disclosure Project, again, an NGO, again, a very long experience. And the Climate Bonds Initiative. And they produce standards that help companies that want to issue climate or green bonds to show compliance to their investors. And they do that at quite a technical level. So I'm a member of the technical working group for grid standards of the Climate Bonds Initiative, and it's being done in a way that that tries to balance the needs of the company that wants to raise funding and the needs of the investors for disclosure and tracking and environmental rigor. So there's a lot of information on that. So whoever's responsible in your organization for reporting, I suggest that you send them there and they have a look at that. So that brings us to what are the government actions? Don't know, I guess some of you will recognize that. That's the Ministry of Finance in Minsk. So there are really two options for the government. Well, it can ignore the fact that there's a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So what will happen is that with every good that is being sent to the EU, the exporter will also send money to the EU to pay for the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Money goes into the EU project and they use it, for example, for support for clean energy, and lots of projects inside the EU gets financed. So that's great for the EU. Or you mitigate. So for that, you need to wait as to what exactly does the mitigation option look like. But if you mitigate, then the goods still get sent to the EU, but the exporter still pays, but this time they pay the Ministry of Finance, they don't pay the EU. The money stays in Belarus, it stays in the Belarusian budget, and you can use it for, well, whatever you want to, really. Or almost whatever you want to, as long as it's compliant with state aid. I would have thought from the Belarusian perspective, the more attractive option than the other one. So there are a number of questions that or decisions that are needed at this point. Not at this point, but I think once the EU has published what exactly they want to do. So how exposed does Belarus want to be to a carbon border adjustment mechanism? So what's plan B? Are you going to export to other countries? Is the impact big enough to worry about? And maybe it isn't at the economy level, but I think the indications are also from discussions in the Russian exporter community that they will actually be significant. Well, just to give you an idea, for Russia, I've seen estimates ranging from 3 billion to 60 billion a year that Russian companies would have to pay for a carbon border adjustment mechanism. At that point, I think it's fair to say nobody really knows. Yeah, so if your range of options go from 3 to 60, it's fair to say that people probably don't have very much of a clue what it's going to be eventually. But but I think everybody can agree there will be an impact. But it may not be big enough for the government to worry about. Yeah. The next question is, are the mitigating policies that are allowed by the EU feasible in Belarus? So, if you invest lots of money in renewables, is that actually possible technically? Or is it do nothing possible policy preferable given the cost of the mitigating policy? So, and then let's assume you're going down the road of introducing mitigating policies. What exactly would you do with the funds raised from these taxes, trading schemes, or levies? And what support do the target sectors need to to continue to export, not to support? That's another typo. So what support do target sectors require to be able to continue to export? That's quite important, really, because that then gets into questions such as state aid and overall economic modernization. But I think there's potential there that funds could be directed in this way. So the plan of action, from my perspective, would be, well, figure out how exposed you are, identify the critical sectors, assess the carbon content, and estimate how much that's going to cost you based on the observed EU ETS prices. When you've done that, you identify the mitigating measures that are possible, a range of options. And you probably have to discuss and agree those with the EU if you want to be absolutely certain that it's okay. And then you implement the measures and you utilize the funds that you've raised as you consider appropriate. So there are probably two levels of potential actions. So one is at the national systemic level. So you just introduce a carbon tax that would probably do it, or you introduce emission sectors that could be done economy-wide or for some specific sectors. Similar to what Kazakhstan did a few years ago, they first included some sectors in emissions trading. The EU did it as well. Only emitters above a certain threshold were included. And then you introduce nationwide policies to reduce carbon intensity of the economy. So a nationwide drive for energy efficiency, renewable energy policies, those kind of things. At the sector level, well, you could look at specific levies. So, you just, every ton of metal that is being produced in the country just has a levy attached to it for carbon emissions. That's a straightforward one. And you could then use the levies that you raise to provide support, but that will need to be, almost certainly would need to be aligned with EU state aid principles. So you probably couldn't use it to essentially just reimburse the carbon tax to the export. It has to be used differently. So at the national level, taxation, carbon tax, similar level to the EU pricing. Then you might be able to adjust that for purchasing power parity. We need to see how that looks. Emissions trading, well, as was suggested before, just connect to the EU ETS, and that would probably solve the problem as well. Or make a system, your own system that's fully compatible. That would probably work as well. And you can do that based on the most exposed sectors. So for example, in Belarus, because you're not really exporting that much electricity directly, you could exclude the electricity generation sector, but you could include the steel sector. Then policy support, okay, national policies for renewable energy production, energy efficiency requirements, I outlined those before. Engagement, yeah, you probably will have to work with the EU, and that's not going to be comfortable because the EU is in the driving seat. They will do what they want to do, and they're not going to substantially amend it in order to accommodate the interests of third countries. That's not something the EU does very much. And the smaller the third country is, the less inclined they are to do so. But it will help to engage early with the EU partners and to learn as much as possible about this to help prepare your industries. So try to get plugged into the discussions at EU level and try to understand what exactly is going on there, follow the discussions of EU trade associations, and get a good grasp of where the discussion is at, and gather all this intelligence and use it. At the sector level, well, you could introduce levies. The levies could be also probably just simply for exports, so you don't levy CO2 content on every ton of metal that is being produced, but you just do it for the ones that are being exported to the EU. So that for the EU exports, you have a similar price, and that's it. Direct support, yes, you can help your companies to do the support, but my guess is it would have to be compatible with state aid principles, even though there isn't going to be legal assessment, but it might quite well end up being the case that the mitigating policy is not being accepted if it's seen as straightforward subsidization and thereby circumventing the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So let me sum up. In my view, the carbon border adjustment mechanism will come, and you need to be prepared for it. Mitigating policies are national and sectoral level policies, and they are, in my view, most likely to be Belarus's best options. The good news is that while the current levels of carbon content are probably quite high across Belarusian exports that may be exposed to a carbon border adjustment mechanism, there's substantial room for improvement and efficiency that will bring this down and make your products competitive again if this is introduced. So the next step would be, start working closely with the EU very early on to understand well what will come and prepare. Check out what are called no regrets policies, so policies that make sense regardless of whether there's a carbon border adjustment mechanism or not. For example, energy efficiency is generally no regrets. Think at the system level. So Belarus has an NDC, I think, was considering adopting the final version of the updated NDC as well. The actions that you take to mitigate a carbon border adjustment mechanism will help you deliver the NDC. So there's a benefit there as well. So if you think of it holistically, there are trade-offs, there are synergies, and you can exploit those. But you need to engage with the process. Ignore and avoid won't work. So this isn't the solution to your carbon border adjustment challenge. It won't go away. Belarus won't be exempt. Your economy is very much exposed, and you need to deal with it. So just very briefly, for those who are interested, this is our team. We're a very small consultancy working on climate finance in particular, but also a few other things, and based in London. But both myself and my managing director, Marta, we have worked for the EBRD for a long time, and therefore have quite an affinity for the Eastern Partnership region and Belarus in particular. Thank you very much. That concludes the presentation, and I'm happy to receive any questions that you may have.
Andres, thank you. So we will proceed to the questions that we have in our chat box, and I will announce a few of them. So 2 questions were received from Mr. Merkel. I will quote them. Hence, I have a few questions relatively the data provided in the questions. So I also invite representatives from the energy sector to comment on the data in the questions. So the first question is, there is roughly 1% renewable energy in the Belarusian electricity mix. Could the incumbent utility Belenergo sell those separately to companies subject to CBAM? Or might there be issue with additionality, double counting? So this was the first question. And the second question from the same person on the similar matter. Belarus soon has nuclear energy covering 50% of its electricity production. What is the CBAM effect? Just a reduction of CO2 content per kilowatt hour in the overall electricity mix. One more time, the data provided, I question it. So if there are any representatives who can comment on it, and please, Luca, Andres, can you follow up on the questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I think this is it's easy, but it's not going to be satisfying. I think we need to wait and see how exactly the EU proposals look like. I could, for example, there's a question of will it be site specific or will it be sort of just a general factor for every product. So then there's the structure of the Belarusian exports to the EU. So, for example, I expect that most of the Belarusian metals exports are probably accounted for by BMZ, and therefore, if BMZ just made itself completely carbon-free, it would bring down it could bring down the level for everyone, but would in any case affect most people. If it's just an accounting trick, I don't think it would last very long as a mitigating measure. Somebody would look at it and would come up with additional regulations to prevent that from happening. So if you just say, okay, we've got 1% renewables and we just assign all of that to BMZ, and therefore all the electricity of BMZ that BMZ consumes is now carbon-free. Job done. Sure, that may work for a very short time, but it's not going to work for very long. You'd be much safer if you could show that it's additional renewable electricity. The question on carbon, yeah. Okay, sorry, that's no problem. So one second, let me just try something here. Okay. So the question is really what will happen if the mitigating measure is perceived by the EU to be a circumvention of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It may then work for a very short time, but I don't think it's going to last for very long. Somebody will understand that that is what is happening in Brussels, and they will put in place measures to stop it and essentially prevent you from utilizing, the same renewable electricity just for a slightly different purpose. You would be in a much better place if you could show that it's new renewable capacity. That's sort of my view on the renewables. On the nuclear, yes, the nuclear energy will reduce the CO2 content in the overall electricity mix. So when the EU calculates the average carbon content of the electricity in Belarus, that will be taken into account, almost certainly. It's being taken into account by everybody else right now when they look at carbon accounting. So that will have that effect. I'm handing over to Luca to see what he thinks on that.
Repeating basically what you just said regarding the effect of CBAM and the interplay with the nuclear power. Ultimately, the effect of this type of adjustment measure is to induce higher energy efficiency in the system. So what I would expect is a larger use of low carbon or non-fossil fuel generation. So ultimately, a larger fraction of the generation of nuclear power. I was posting in the chat the relatively recent work that the Energy Community Secretariat did with actually with several different country members, including Macedonia, Ukraine, I believe, on the study of the implications of potential application of, just going back to what Ivan was asking earlier, equivalent measures. What would be the implication of equivalent measures, how those equivalent measures could mitigate the potential reduction in import of electricity. And I suspect that Section 6 might be able to address some of the points that Torsten is some of the questions that Torsten is asking.
Thank you. We'll go to a question from Mr. Churban. What about nuclear power? Would electricity produced by a nuclear power plant be considered as a low carbon product?
Yes, it would be.
It's an effect, exactly. It's again, it's the ultimate effect. I believe. Is it Albania? Correct me if I'm wrong, Andreas. Maybe you are more info. Is it Albania that is fully hydro or fully nuclear? So I remember in that analysis of the Energy Community Secretariat, there are no restriction whatsoever. It's basically a fossil-free generation.
Yeah, it's hydro in Albania.
Okay.
Yeah, it's yeah. There are a few countries around that are quite lucky in that regard, but there's a separate issue that is that it's all hydro now. If it continues to grow, if power production continues to grow, it's not going to be all hydro in 10 or 15 years. So additional power production would have to come from elsewhere. But they are doing quite well on installing solar and I think even wind now in Albania.
Thank you. We have two people raised their hands. Vladislav Artyukh, and then Alexei. I cannot see the last name. So, Владислав, пожалуйста. Артюк, да, вы можете unmute себя и задать вопрос?
Еще раз попробуйте, пожалуйста, микрофон включить. У вас сейчас есть права.
Да, здравствуйте, мне не давало технически это сделать. The question is regarding the most probable and most likely sectors and products which will be subject to the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Specifically, I'm interested in two things. Will it be close to the current sectors and products which are subject to the EU emission trading system, and how likely are glass and glass products and woodworking sectors to be included into the list of this sectors which are subject to the CBAM?
Well, okay, so glass, I would expect is a very good candidate for inclusion. I haven't seen it mentioned myself, but there's a sort of there's a raw materials, a sort of generic moniker that glass could come under, and it's a tricky one though, because I'm not an industrial engineer, and certainly I'm not a glass engineer. But I would expect that you have quite different carbon factors, whether it's new glass or recycled glass, the share of recycled glass that you're using, those kind of things. Probably different quality levels of glass as well, and in what form, you know, if it's being exported as some sort of intermediate product or final product, whatever. I don't know enough about that, but I think, you know, simply from its nature as quite an energy-intensive product, I would expect it to, you know, to be a good candidate for inclusion. Also because there's quite a substantial glass industry in the EU that will certainly right now be lobbying the EU Commission and the country governments for it to be included in the scheme, so that they get the protection that they want. The woodworking sector, I think that's far more tricky, because you're then getting into questions such as deforestation, afforestation, land use, change in forestry, which are quite methodologically complex. Yeah, so that's you know, I don't know enough about, for example, the afforestation, deforestation rate in Belarus. Yeah, so the woodworking sector, yes, there's an energy input, but I suspect that most of the carbon input would probably come from the wood itself that is being cut. But on the other hand, that carbon is essentially almost permanently stored. Yeah, I mean, unless you use the wood for wood pellets that are being burned in a power station, which I know happens. I think there's a power station across the border in the Baltics that tends to get at least some of the pellets from Belarus. But unless that's the case, if it's wood for, you know, for IKEA, if it's wood for building, that's permanently locked carbon. It's not going to go anywhere. Yeah, so so that in itself doesn't have emissions. Then you look at the sectoral level, you may actually, you know, cut the wood, make IKEA furniture, and then on the same spot that you cut the old wood, you grow new wood, which then absorbs carbon again. The old carbon is locked in IKEA furniture in my bedroom. And how do you account for that? It really gets very, very tricky. Yeah. So I don't think for the reasons of methodology, I don't think the wood work sector would be one of the prime ones for inclusion. But I don't know. I mean, that might just be my ignorance. Luca, do you have a view on that?
I suspect that most reasonable assumption we can make at this stage is that all sectors that are currently covered under the EU ETS ideally would be and equally covered under border adjustment tax. Now, is that feasible data-wise and technology-wise? Maybe. I believe that the Energy Secretariat did a test using the electricity sector because it's very easy. Electricity is perfectly fungible, whether it's produced domestically or not domestically. Currently what the European Commission is doing is a full assessment and general equilibrium assessment of all the other potential input variables. So I would again assume that all sectors currently covered under the EU ETS potentially could be subject to a BCEM, most likely electricity to be the first one, and then to be seen the rest.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Дальше у нас руку держит Алексей Терещенко. Мы сейчас сможем убрать, или уже сделали, да, нет? Алексей Терещенко, включите микрофон, да и задайте, пожалуйста.
Я вас слушаю. Можно, да? Я хотел поблагодарить Андреаса о том, что он на примере БМЗ привел пример по металлургии. У меня такой вопрос возникает. Мы все прекрасно понимаем, что та продукция, которая идет в Евросоюз, она является серьезной продукцией, которая идет для производства покрышек. Это металлокорд, высокоуглеродистые марки стали, это специфические марки стали, а также металл, который идет на производство автокомпонентов. Поэтому по специфике производства здесь будут выбросы, мы никуда от этого не денемся. Углерод будем выбрасывать. Но в связи с тем, что было вот заявлено о том, что атомная промышленность наша, так сказать, производство электроэнергии будет считаться низкоуглеродистой, так, низкопотенциальной по углероду. Мой вопрос в том, мы должны будем учитывать данный вопрос в наших отчетах о том, что мы используем электроэнергию, выработанную на атомной станции. Это будет зачтено нам как снижение углеродного следа, я так понимаю. Спасибо.
I would expect so. Yes, I mean, if all of the electricity you use in your operations come from green steel, so for example, if you're operating an electric arc furnace that is run on nuclear power, then I hesitate a little bit, but from a climate change perspective, you could argue that is green steel. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that environmental campaigners would have quite strong views on the matter, but essentially the carbon emissions they're not totally absent, but they are very, very low, and therefore yes, that ought to be considered if the assessment is being done on a site-specific basis. Now, again, considering the weight of BMZ in the metal sector in Belarus, it's probably not much of a difference, but yeah. But I would expect you to be able to benefit from that fact.
Спасибо.
Коллеги, спасибо. У нас вопросы перешли в такую практикоориентированную область. Это хорошо, значит, что тема интересует действительно реальный сектор. К Андреасу Кулуке поступил такой вопрос, который, опять же, коллеги из Европы, наверное, лучше знают, на каком этапе сейчас находится процесс внедрения, механизма внедрения CBAM. Вопрос звучит следующим образом. Какие документы экспортеры нефтепродуктов должны предъявить в качестве доказательства того, что при производстве нефтепродуктов использовалась чистая энергия АЭС? Я так понимаю, что этот вопрос частично пересекается с предыдущим, ранее заданным вопросом, и он, наверное, может быть переформатирован в более широком контексте. То есть насколько на сегодняшний день вот все процедуры они разработаны, либо планируется их завершить к такому-то периоду? И можете ли вы вот коллегам, я так понимаю, из реального сектора, возможно, из концерна Белнефтехим, либо из НПЗ, вот некие сейчас более или менее такие конкретные ответы по этому вопросу предоставить? Спасибо.
Luca, Andres, did you hear the question?
Luca, do you want to go first?
Yeah, yes, I can, but I don't have an answer. So I don't know what is the specific formulation of that document. As I was mentioning earlier, at the moment, it's much easier to check import-export of electricity because the technology allows very immediately, instantaneously, to understand what is imported and exported potentially. It's possible to determine the way that particular megawatts, how it has been produced, that particular megawatts that is imported, meaning has it been produced using a fossil generation or not. I believe that when it comes to other industries, there is still some analysis to be done, not to mention what type of forms will be needed to prove what exactly, how and what exactly have you been using for your production. I was just checking just now, there is a company called Expansive, again, I'll post on the chat, and they promise to be able to track this type of information. So going back to the previous gentleman, he was mentioning, how can I, should I prove that in my production, I have been using greener generation? These particular type of companies are promising technology that would allow you to track exactly what is the type of generation you've been using, electricity you've been using for your production. But forms at this stage, I really have no real insights.
Yeah, I think in terms of the actual procedures and all of that, we really need to wait until the proposals are published. However, first of all, what might be helpful is to look at the forms that are currently being used by the EU ETS. But the other one that might be helpful is, ultimately you need to be able to demonstrate that what you've done or what you claim you've done, i.e. you've used only nuclear generated power, is actually what you've done. So how do you demonstrate it? Well, one is you have a power supply contract with the nuclear power plant, for a certain amount of power every year. And the second one are your meter readings that show that you have used that amount of power or less in every year. So these two documents should be auditable. Or indeed should be confirmed by your auditors. And then if KPMG puts a stamp on it or PwC, then it's good enough. So, you've got a supply contract for whatever, 2 terawatt hours for your refinery, and you've got a use of 1.8 terawatt hours. The assumption is, well, that's all going to have come from the nuclear power station. The other issue that might need to be shown then is that it's clear that the nuclear power station isn't selling its nuclear output to multiple customers at the same time in order to circumvent the carbon border adjustment mechanism. But that's not so much your problem. But yeah, so whatever you have in terms of the documentation about your supply, you need to have that at auditable quality so that it can pass any sort of review. And that is the basis for filling in whichever form needs to be filled in eventually.
Thank you, Alex. У нас есть еще один вопрос, который поступил к нам из чата от коллеги Владимира Рака. Он касается энергетической политики национальной, поиска, наверное, некого разумного баланса между решением стратегической задачи использования местных видов топлива и, опять же, снижением выбросов парниковых газов от сектора электроэнергетики. Значит, вопрос звучит следующим образом. Сегодня на официальном канале Министерства энергетики появился пост следующего содержания. За последние 7 лет объем потребления фрезерного торфа на объектах жилищно-коммунального хозяйства вырос в 1,8 раз. Объем потребления фрезерного топлива на котельных достиг за последние 7 лет 63,7 тысяч тонн условного топлива, и мы в последующую пятилетку планируем увеличить этот объем еще до 160 тысяч тонн. И вопрос состоит в том, могут ли, наверное, коллеги из Министерства энергетики, либо коллеги из Департамента по энергоэффективности прокомментировать эти планы по наращиванию потребления торфа и каким образом эти планы коррелируют с необходимостью снижения выбросов парниковых газов в Республике Беларусь, потому что здесь, насколько мы понимаем, имеет место конфликт между целями и задачами наращивания ресурсной базы местных видов топлива и необходимостью снижать выбросы в наиболее углеродоемком секторе, это производство электрической и тепловой энергии. Если можно, коллеги из органов государственного управления, кто сегодня с нами, прокомментируйте, пожалуйста, кто готов ответить. Руку поднимите, если можно. Александр, наш помощник технический, вам административное право даст, сможете задать вопрос через микрофон. Если не ответите, мы сами прокомментируем, что хуже. Наверное, давайте я тогда попробую короткий коммент предоставить. На самом деле, действительно, мы имеем здесь в некоторой степени конфликтную ситуацию, потому что тот же торф, он не относится по современной классификации к низкоуглеродным видам топлива. И когда мы в долгосрочной перспективе планируем национальную энергетическую политику, стратегию увеличения объемов потребления местных видов топливно-энергетических ресурсов, вот этот вопрос необходимости снижения выбросов парниковых газов, он, безусловно, должен учитываться. И важность этого вопроса будет возрастать и возрастать в дальнейшем. Это говорит о том, что те базовые условия, которые закладываются в основу долгосрочной энергетической политики и закладывались, например, 5 либо 10 лет назад, на сегодняшний день, они претерпели достаточно серьезные изменения. И нам, в Беларуси, необходимо, безусловно, к соответствующим изменениям быть готовыми и должным образом корректировать национальную политику в области топливно-энергетического комплекса. Еще такой, знаете, финализирующий блок комментариев, поскольку мы уже практически приблизились к завершению, я хотел бы посвятить вот основной тематике нашего сегодняшнего обсуждения. Это как раз вопросами внедрения трансграничного углеродного регулирования. Почему это важно? Как сегодня сказали коллеги, вопрос на сегодняшний день заключается не в том, важно это для нас или не важно. Вопрос заключается в том, что либо мы будем внедрять подобные механизмы у себя, и причем в достаточно короткий период времени, либо мы будем платить. На сегодняшний день мы столкнулись с ситуацией, когда без внедрения подобного рода механизмов в Республике Беларусь дополнительная финансовая нагрузка, которая ляжет на наши наиболее энергоуглеродоемкие предприятия, она будет неприемлема для этих предприятий. Ну, чтобы было понятно, если не учитывать экспорт нефтепродуктов в страны Европейского Союза, то наша экспортная корзина в страны ЕС, она составляет, ну, по очень таким укрупненным оценкам, где-то порядка 3 миллиардов долларов по итогам 2020 года. Это свыше 130-140 таких достаточно крупных товарных позиций, которые охватывают производство азотных удобрений, продукцию цементных предприятий, стекольных предприятий, металлургическую продукцию, продукцию концерна Беллисбумпром. Все те механизмы, которые мы сегодня обсуждали, и все те новые регулятивные изменения, зеленая сделка, Green Deal, они создают на пути нашего товарного экспорта на сегодняшний день чрезвычайно серьезные барьеры. В связи с тем, что маржинальность экспортных поставок зачастую относительно невысока, в связи с тем, что Беларусь не является членом Всемирной торговой организации и не пользуется преференциальными режимами торговли с Европейским Союзом, нашему товарному экспорту будет в случае запуска подобных механизмов и неготовности национальной нормативно-правовой базы нашему товарному экспорту по указанным позициям будет поставлен просто, такие, знаете, очень серьезные заслоны, что практически обнулит этот экспорт. Он будет неконкурентоспособен по цене. В связи с этим, безусловно, есть ряд вопросов, которые должны быть решены в масштабах страны и в рамках более широкого Евразийского экономического союза достаточно оперативно. Что сейчас делается, над чем работают органы государственного управления, насколько нам известно? Разработан так называемый план мероприятий по созданию системы углеродного регулирования в Республике Беларусь, который охватывает и механизмы, значит, мероприятия, направленные на снижение углерода, энергоемкости промышленной продукции, на запуск механизмов углеродных единиц, на разработку соответствующих методологических основ оценки углеродного следа промышленной продукции предприятий, которые предполагается экспортировать, в первую очередь, в наши наиболее энергоемкие отрасли. Необходимо разработать методологические основы по оценке выбросов парниковых газов от различных типов технологических установок. Предлагается совершенствовать нормативно-правовую базу в части проведения энергетических обследований энергоемких предприятий для обеспечения расчета выбросов парниковых газов в соответствии с верифицированными на международном уровне методиками. Важный вопрос, который предполагается решить в ближайшее время, это совершенствование методологии отраслевого бизнес-планирования. То есть, как мы предполагаем, важные задачи, которые должны быть решены, это актуализация бизнес-планов валообразующих предприятий, экспортеров, которые занимаются поставками стран ЕС, в части возможности достижения показателей углеродоемкости, энергоемкости выпуска продукции, соответствующей лучшим отраслевым значениям. Поскольку на период до 2025 года разработано несколько предложений по нескольким сотням инвестиционных проектов, необходимо уже сейчас понимать, даже в случае, если эти проекты будут реализованы в промышленности, особенно в сфере энерго- и углеродоемких отраслей, смогут ли эти проекты привести к достижению показателей энергоемкости и углеродоемкости продукции, которые позволят этим предприятиям быть конкурентоспособными. Отдельно предлагается внести изменения в методические рекомендации по разработке бизнес-планов инвестиционных проектов и включить ключевые показатели оценки эффективности этих бизнес-планов, индикаторы углеродоемкости и энергоемкости, чтобы уже на этапе бизнес-планирования исключить инвестиционные ошибки. Также большое внимание, по нашему мнению, по мнению органов госуправления, должно уделяться развитию соответствующих инструментов финансирования. Проблема состоит в том, что модернизация, перевооружение тех предприятий, которые в первую очередь смогут попасть под удар, они, безусловно, сопряжены с чрезвычайно высокими инвестиционными издержками. И мы на сегодняшний день видим устойчивый такой тренд, что международные финансовые институты, коммерческие банки все более и более стремятся становиться зелеными с точки зрения выбора инвестиционных проектов. Когда у вас есть дефицит инвестиционных ресурсов внутри страны, и вы предполагаете использовать международные финансовые ресурсы, эти финансовые ресурсы, возможность финансовыми институтами зарубежными выделить вам финансовые ресурсы, они будут упираться в то, насколько энергоэффективным либо углеродоемким будет, либо не будет ваш инвестиционный проект. То есть мы здесь видим достаточно большие угрозы с точки зрения возможности белорусских предприятий привлекать внешнее финансирование для технологической модернизации, технического перевооружения, создания новых промышленных производств. Также важный момент, на который надо обратить внимание. Сейчас крайне важным элементом, который помогает предприятиям привлекать более дешевые длинные финансовые ресурсы, является подготовка корпоративной отчетности в соответствии с международными стандартами. Мы видим, что на сегодняшний день, к сожалению, у нас нет позитивного такого опыта по выпуску ESG облигаций в соответствии с некоторыми другими системами международными, корпоративной отчетности в области устойчивого развития. Все это те вопросы, которые должны также быть решены в обозримой перспективе. И, естественно, мы не можем обойти стороной вопрос и потребность оперативной разработки в ближайшее время достаточно серьезного комплекса технических нормативных правовых актов, которые позволят указанную сферу углеродного регулирования запустить и, скажем так, снять тем самым какую-то часть угрозы, с которой мы можем столкнуться. Поэтому те задачи, те вопросы, которые обсуждаются на такого рода семинарах, как сегодняшний семинар, они самым непосредственным образом затрагивают интересы и перспективы развития реального сектора экономики и от того, насколько активно и интенсивно будет организовано в этом межведомственное взаимодействие по указанным вопросам, будет зависеть, сможет ли наша экономика адаптироваться вот к этим достаточно серьезным вызовам, которые несет та же зеленая сделка, долгосрочная политика не только Европейского Союза, но и наших ближайших соседей, тоже России и Украины в этой части. Поэтому здесь, безусловно, необходима достаточно большая длительная системная работа на перспективу. Ирина, я тогда, наверное, вам слово передаю. Если, может быть, у коллег есть какие-то комментарии, дополнения на сей счет, пожалуйста, будем рады послушать и ваше мнение. Если нет, мы тогда приближаемся к завершению нашего семинара.
У нас есть еще последний вопрос. Мы предоставим слово Игорю Чурбе. Игорь, вы можете?
Yes, I can. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Да, хорошо слышно.
Yeah, thanks a lot, first of all, Andreas, Luca, for your presentation and this dialogue, very informative and interesting from my point of view. And now to my question. Andreas, you mentioned that as mitigation measures, countries can create their own national taxation or carbon emission mechanisms. And my understanding is that these mechanisms should be formally recognized by the European Commission to be considered under any CBAM negotiations. Is it correct? And if it is correct, is there any recognition procedures under development currently or maybe in place currently? And another part of this question is, Belarus is a small country, and Andreas mentioned that the smaller the country, the slimmer the chance that it will be held by the European Commission. And what would you recommend in this case for such small countries as Belarus? Should they become a part of a bigger system, let's say emission trading system built around Russia, or any other suggestions are going to be held by the EU? Thank you.
Igor. I think Luca is the expert on the ETS. My understanding is that there are currently, if you have an ETS, then linkage is possible to the EU system, so there must be a recognition procedure for that. When you have a different measure, then yes, that will have to be assessed as to whether it achieves a similar outcome. So again, I would expect the EU to propose procedures and a recognition system for that. So there would probably be some assessment, probably similar to the financial sector equivalency assessment of financial sector regulations, where the EU unilaterally determines whether the country's system is sufficient to pass the test. So they do that with financial sector right now. Yeah, so a country can have access to EU markets in the financial sector if its regulations are deemed of equivalent quality to the EU. So they don't have to be the same letter by letter, but they have to achieve the same outcomes. And but it's a unilateral process, and it can be withdrawn overnight. Yeah, so it's totally in the control of the European Commission. So Luca, anything from your end, maybe on the linkage? Or?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Very relevant point, Igor. Actually, super interesting to see the immediate perspective about what makes most sense for countries in terms of designing their own systems. In principle, it would be better to be part of a larger, broader system of a very, very simple economic reasons. And that's exactly what happened for Switzerland and Norway, eventually being integrated, being now part of the European systems. The China, I think, is working as a gravitas. So the national system in China is now becoming a gravitas for many other satellite systems that are going to emerge and will be linked. So I suspect that for Belarus would make sense, given that Russia is exploring the possibility to having a nationwide system, to be part already of one or the other system, the other mechanism. I believe that Macedonia, under this particular study that I was mentioning, Macedonia is already set in stone, so approved the design of a system, and is already exploring the possibility to link it, to connect this to the European system.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Мы уже исчерпали запланированное время в соответствии с нашей программой, поэтому благодарим вас за сегодняшнюю встречу, за ваше время и участие. Надеемся очень, что вебинар был для всех полезен и является для кого-то основой, для кого-то продолжением на пути к устойчивому низкоуглеродному развитию. Андреас, Лука, спасибо большое, что были сегодня с вами, и за ваш вклад в сегодняшний вебинар. Отдельное спасибо нашим переводчикам и техническим специалистам. Время обеда, так что желаем всем приятного аппетита и отличного остатка дня. Спасибо вам, берегите себя. До свидания.
До свидания.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.